November 3rd, 2018, the Distinguished Lecture Series, a panel discussion on the 30th anniversary of Joint Verification Experiment, Kearsarge.
Good afternoon. I'm Jordan McGee, Director of Education. For those of you who don't know me here at the museum, I want to thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon for our final Distinguished Lecture Series event of the year. I know many of you have already asked me about the schedule for next year, and I promise it is coming soon. I should have a draft with a few dates announced within the next couple of weeks, so stay tuned for that. I'm going to sit up here and prompt these distinguished panelists with a few questions when needed. I'm going to let most of the talking come from them because they all have the stories you want to hear. And then at the end, we'll take questions from the audience. And actually, if there are any veterans of the JVE in the audience that just have their own stories that they want to share, you don't necessarily have a question, you're welcome to do that as well. Next to me is Joe Beanie. We have Guy Allen and Nick Aquilina. And I'm going to turn it over to Nick to do a little bit more detailed introduction.
Since 1951, when the test site started, known as the Nevada Proving Grounds, it's done a lot of important things, mostly in the area of national security, obviously. But for some reason, people didn't know too much about the test site. I'm never sure why. But it did a lot of important things, it did a lot of wonderful things, and each year had its own important things that it did. 1988, many of us think, was a special year. It was a historical year, and once again, I could never understand why people didn't understand what was happening at the test site in 1988, and they didn't understand some of the reasons that the things were being done. We hope today to have a chance to explain some of that to you. I also was concerned that during that period of 1988, the national news media showed little attention to it. No interest, no attention. With the exception of our local newspapers, the Las Vegas Review-Journal with Keith Rogers and Mary over at the Las Vegas Sun, they did write some stories. But the rest of the country did not. What we hope to do today with the three of us who were involved in the 1988 programs is to bring some of that information to you. Not only in the sense of what the actual tests we're doing, but we'd like to talk a little bit about the interpersonal relationships that were developed between our people and the Soviet Union visitors. In fact, that may really be the true story of JVE, was that interpersonal relationships that existed. Before we do that, though, we are fortunate that we have a video by Paul Robinson, Ambassador Paul Robinson, who will talk about the history of the JVE, and will talk about the reasons for the need of the joint verification experiment. Paul was a former senior scientist at Los Alamos before he was appointed as the ambassador for discussions on nuclear test talks by President Reagan. Subsequent to his work as an ambassador, Paul then became the president of Sandia National Laboratories. Paul will give us some of that thing now. We could start it, listen to Paul, and then we'll come back and start discussing stuff.
The joint verification experiment took place in 1988 on the world stage. It included 2 nuclear weapon explosions. The first was carried out at the then Nevada test site in the USA. Today it's known as the Nevada National Security Site, On August 17, 1988 was the first explosion. The second explosion took place in the USSR on September 14th of 1988 in what is today the Semipalatinsk site in Kazakhstan. What greatly distinguished these tests from all previous ones was that the JBE had both nations participating in a cooperative verification trial to jointly use and evaluate proposed measurement systems that might be used for future verification. The JBE became the centerpiece of the nuclear testing talks, the full-scale negotiations between the U.S. and the USSR. I believe history has shown that the JBE was essential to the work of those delegations in completing verification protocols for the Threshold Test Ban Treaty and for the Treaty on Underground Nuclear Explosions for Peaceful Purposes. These are usually known by their shorthand abbreviations as the TTBT and the PNET. The two nuclear testing treaties had been negotiated between the USSR and the USA in the mid-1970s. The treaty's central requirement was to limit the yield of nuclear explosions to 150 kilotons or less. The original purpose for seeking the treaties was to encourage both parties to reject the use of very high-yield weapons, which were seen to be the most destabilizing were they ever to be used. The TTBT had been negotiated by Henry Kissinger for the U.S. and Andrei Gromyko for the USSR and was signed on July 3, 1974 by Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev. The PNET, the companion treaty, was negotiated by delegations of both sides in Geneva and signed on May 28, 1976 by Gerald Ford and Leonid Brezhnev. These two companion treaties had a proviso that one could not enter into force without the other, as the second treaty served to prevent an obvious path to undermining the first treaty if one were to use a nuclear weapon as the explosive device in an otherwise explosion for peaceful purposes, like digging a new dam, but in the process one could thereby gain military information. Yet these treaties were not immediately ratified and did not enter into force for more than a dozen years. The principal reason for that is that concerns arose nearly immediately on both sides that the 150 kiloton limit might have been exceeded in tests carried out soon after the signing. In fact, over those years and using only their national technical means, as had been provided for in the treaties, and which meant for the most part the use of teleseismic detectors, the very same instrument used to detect and measure the strengths of earthquakes, each of the side had filed multiple demarches to the other side for what appeared to them to be violations of the compliance requirements of the treaty. Without doubt, these years of controversy were damaging to the overall relationships between the United States and the Soviet Union. You certainly know the old cliche about strong fences make good neighbors. Similarly, there's a corollary: strong verification makes good treaties. And thus the route to achieve better relations seemed clear. Confidence building measures at a minimum, if not in fact a major departure in the means of measurement of test yields, would be needed in order to improve the verification of these nuclear testing treaties. A potential path forward emerged in the mid-1980s as Gorbachev began his glasnost, or openness, agenda. This looked like a means to resolve those verification issues. Bear in mind, all these events were taking place during the Cold War years, and the process which emerged to remove those mutual suspicions regarding treaty violations helped to warm up the relations between our nations. When, within the intermediate nuclear force treaty negotiations in Geneva, a proposal that would open up for the first time the territories of both nations to on-site inspectors, including at some of the nuclear weapons facilities. That was considered a long-awaited breakthrough. That proposal renewed interest in finding ways to resolve the controversy surrounding the nuclear testing treaties, and particularly to resolve those disagreements over the yield through a new regime in which direct on-site measurements of the yields of nuclear tests might be jointly carried out. Then one novel and unprecedented idea arose: to begin by conducting jointly a verification experiment, wherein each side would conduct a nuclear test at their own test sites while inviting the other side to bring its experts on site along with agreed pieces of equipment and directly measure the yield of the explosion. The principle of complete reciprocity was to be preeminent throughout that process. A commitment was made to adopt such a plan by the U.S. Secretary of State and the Soviet Foreign Minister. They named the concept the Joint Verification Experiment, or JVE, on December 8, 1987 at the Washington Summit. This was in fact the fourth such summit between President Ronald Reagan and President Mikhail Gorbachev. Their agreement outlined a variety of goals to be met by the experiment. Each side took the position that the JVE would be undertaken as a true experiment, with the techniques proposed by either side for use in yield measurements undertaken on just a trial basis. And then each method's performance would be carefully evaluated in a mutual and a transparent manner. The overall accuracy of the yield measurements had to be balanced against its relative degree of intrusiveness to prevent access to secret design information of the nuclear devices which were being used. By agreeing to fully share the data measured by either side, it was believed that the JVE could set the stage for agreement on verification techniques that were intended to be enshrined within new protocols for the TTBT and PNET treaties. Final choices of acceptable techniques would be based on a thorough evaluation of the methods proposed and actually demonstrated to be successful in the JVE by either side. In November of 1987, I was asked to get involved, and I agreed to serve Ronald Reagan as the chief negotiator and head of the U.S. delegation. My counterpart for the USSR became Ambassador Igor Palyanek of the USSR Foreign Ministry with a similar sized delegation. It was clear to all at the outset of this new role that our delegation's work plan was to have the following steps. The first task was negotiate and obtain agreement by our respective governments for all the ground rules for conducting the proposed JVE. After the two explosions of the JVE were completed, a nuclear test at each test site, we were to each extensively analyze the results and the success or not of the procedures used, and then to share our analyzed data and any key experiences we wanted to discuss, including any lessons learned and any actions we would like to have done differently for the future. Only after completing those tasks were we to settle into final negotiations and commit to the language of new verification protocols to be put forward to governments. And finally, when completed, we were each to seek final approval and the signatures of our presidents prior to a recommitment of the treaties and their new protocols, both of which were to have equal standing for ratification by our respective governments. Amazingly, both for the challenges this involved and the tenor of the times, that plan was exactly the process that ensued, and it was successful. The very first issue, developing the JBE agreement, was completed and signed at the Moscow summit on May 31st of '88. That was the fifth summit between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. Besides spelling out all the technologies which both sides agreed would be used in the joint experiments, the substantial size was necessitated mostly by very detailed guarantees to assure the safety and the personal security of the inspectors and participants while they were on the other's territory. All good intentions by both sides notwithstanding, you see the JBE experiments did begin in what was an atmosphere of great distrust of each other's motives during the Cold War. Although the INF talks had opened the door on the possibility for on-site presence of inspectors from the other side, the participants in the JBE were the first to actually go on to the other side's territory for this purpose, and thus we painstakingly had to lay out in exhaustive detail the rules of the road for these inspectors. Let me tell this audience a story that emerged on the U.S. side in analyzing how the system of laws had developed independently in our two nations. It appeared in the U.S. that everything was automatically allowed unless there had been a law put into place that prohibited a particular action. While in the Soviet Union side, the exact opposite appeared to be the case. Unless there were specific laws authorizing citizens to take a particular action, such actions were to be forbidden. We spent much more time in the delegation working on the rights and privileges to be afforded to inspectors while on the other's territory than we ever did on any of the technical subjects. But soon after the JBE agreement was signed, 26 experts for the Soviet Union, in parallel with a somewhat larger group from the U.S., traveled to each other's test sites, along with extensive amounts of equipment that was agreed to in the document. Extensive inspections of that equipment took place by the testing side before it could be used. Similarly, we began to establish 3 separate seismic stations in each other's territory that were cooperatively constructed and jointly manned during the periods of the JBE explosions. The reason for a relatively much larger presence of U.S. personnel at the Soviet test site in Semipalatinsk, a region which is now within the independent nation of Kazakhstan, is because the Soviet Union requested, and the U.S. agreed, that a U.S. drill team should drill a satellite hole at their site. This was to be a very small diameter hole parallel to the shaft through which the explosive was emplaced and separated from the device emplacement hole by about 11 meters. Yet for all the complexities we dealt with, the schedules held almost exactly according to the originally stated plans in the JBE agreement. And the test in the United States was successfully carried out on August 17, 1988, and the JBE test in the Soviet Union was successfully carried out on September 14th, less than a month apart. The teams performed their work exceptionally well, and the data from the 2 tests were then presented and thoroughly evaluated jointly by the experts within the Geneva talks. The agreed upon verification methods, which were all previously evaluated in the JBE, were these. 1, the use of on-site hydrodynamic yield measures and teleseismic measures, including the use of nearby stations surrounding each test site for any test above a 50 kiloton yield. And a second right, the right to carry out on-site inspection of the emplacement geometry and soils, including the taking of core samples, which also allowed the foregoing of any site measures at the time of the explosion for any planned test above 35 kilotons. But this foregoing of measurements, on-site measurements, was only to be done if the verifying party chose. I was personally quite proud that what would be used should be entirely based on a well-known principle of freedom of choice. After a few more months back in Geneva, we were able to hammer out specific detailed language and the notification arrangements necessary to specify the rights of each side to perform on-site inspections and measurements at the various triggered level of yields. And we did add some protections for hydro measurements under the category of anti-intrusiveness. Then, as a final step, we conformed the text to have the exact same meanings in both the English and Russian languages, and we delivered the text for signing. They were signed at the June 1st, 1990 Washington Summit between George H.W. Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev. From that point on, and after nearly 5 months of intense hearings and direct discussions with senators, I am most pleased that on September 25th of 1990, we were able to achieve unanimous ratification for the first time. It was the first time an arms control agreement had received such unanimity in many years. For both the treaties and protocols, they were unanimously approved by the U.S. Senate. In turn, these won ratification in the Soviet Union on October 9th, and they entered into force that December, on December the 11th, 1990, at a meeting in Houston, Texas. Subsequently, in the next year, the inheritor states of the former USSR, now the CIS, or Commonwealth of Independent States, agreed to accept those agreements, and these remain in force today. Let me then, in beginning to close, as requested, highlight here in retrospect a few of the more and lasting accomplishments we achieved. First, I believe the JEV marked a major accomplishment in the history of arms control as the first action with U.S. arms control experts and inspectors going behind the Iron Curtain and successfully carrying out arms control tasks. 2, even though we began with the precedent achieved in the INF negotiations for on-site presence and measurements, we were the ones who blazed the trail of securing full agreements on the rights and duties of inspectors while on the other's territory. 3, the enormous advantage of the JV approach of try before buy as a precursor to negotiating the treaty-like language of the protocols has become clearly evident to all. The JVE experience has made it possible to write strong and very thorough protocols. I believe it taught each of us to better understand not only our own positions as well as to better understand the other side. It also greatly decreased that natural fear inherent in the challenge to write treaty language that will last forever, especially when it had never yet been put into practice. The JVE filled that need and gave us all great experience and confidence in what we were proposing and what we were writing into the treaty language. 4, the JVE also exposed the enormous value of that always but mostly ephemeral factor we call human nature. There's no doubt that we initially approached each other extremely cautiously in the Cold War. But in working together on common challenges and goals, it was that mutual respect for the individuals on the other side that naturally emerged and that clearly grew over time. Soon it became clear that we were far more alike than different as individuals. smoking preferences set aside. But especially the trust that began to develop among the technical experts of both sides, which had always carried out their past work in great secrecy, while in actuality accomplishing many of the same tasks and having each developed similar skills. These realities emerged along with much respect for the people of both teams and delegation. I still believe it was the mutual respect which provided the basis for many of the later successes that emerge. Finally, let me urge all of us that we should use those JVE and NTT experiences and our working relationships to make other important advances. These past experiences have created many opportunities to jointly cooperate and work together for advantage for our respective nations and for the world at large. Both sides move forward from the JVE pioneering efforts with an unshakable belief that we could write down how best to use the tools of science within an atmosphere of achieving complete fairness for all sides. You will all recall Ronald Reagan's maxim that he loved to quote in Russian, "Dovere non provere," trust but verify. We indeed found a way for both sides to give that a high priority. Today, it's genuinely a great pleasure for me to be able to reminisce on the events of 25 years ago, which we commemorate today, and to suggest how the lessons of those times might be of greater importance for our futures. And my last, but also very best wishes for success goes out to all of you who will join us all in creating a better future. I thank you for your kind attention to my remarks.
So Ambassador Robinson gave a pretty good overview of the whole experiment, but for our panelists, I want to go back, start at the beginning a little bit. First of all, I'm hoping each of you can tell our audience very quickly what your role was on JVE, so especially when we get to the end and they're asking questions, they know who to direct them to. So I'm hoping you can start there, and then I'm curious, once you all get your mics turned on, if you can talk a little bit about what the feeling was about this in the beginning when you all found out you were going to be doing this and taking part in this. I mean, looking back through the lens of history, we know this came near to the end of the Cold War, but we didn't necessarily know that at the time. And I'm curious if there was any hesitancy or fear or anything like that that was kind of stirring, like, should we be doing this? Is this the right path? Is this going to take us in the right direction?
Okay. I was the first U.S. team leader that took the U.S. team out to the Soviet test site in Kazakhstan in April of 1988. And to the question, how did we feel about it? You know, I had worked my whole time, my whole career, in looking at the Soviets as our enemies. And so when I got out there, that was my mindset of these guys, I don't know if we can trust them or not, but the JVE has been negotiated, so we felt that we could go ahead and do that, trusting that they signed the agreement as well as we did. Just to give you an example of what happened, when I first got out to the Soviet test site, we met daily with our counterparts in the Soviet side. The general that ran the that ran the Soviet test site, General Ilyenko, forever, every 5 minutes, well, at the beginning of every meeting, he spent 5 minutes talking about the fact that Jim Magruder had required them to cut the bars off from the windows in the hotel where we're going to be staying. And he kept this up because he said he was concerned about our safety out there in the test site, that there would be people might throw rocks through our windows. And I kind of got tired of that, because for the first week, that was the first 5 minutes of our discussion, was the bars on the windows. And finally, I said, General Ilienko, let me tell you something. I live in Las Vegas, Nevada. I don't have bars on my windows. For me, that represents freedom. In fact, let me just quote some verbiage from a song that said, "Oh, give me land, lots of land, under starry skies above, don't fence me in." That's the last time we ever spoke about the bars on the windows. So that was sort of the introduction for us to, as we met out there, that another thing that we've discovered shortly was when we, after work, the Soviets had prepared an area where we could do recreation, basketball hoop and a volleyball standard. When we first started, we started with teams made up of the U.S. on one side and the Soviets on the other. And that was not working out well, because some was winning and others were losing. And so we decided the best way to avoid having an international incident over a volleyball game was to mix the teams so that you had Soviets and U.S. on both teams. And that solved that problem. So that helped us to get together and develop this relationship.
Okay, my name is Joe Beanie, and back in 1988 I was the test director on a shot called Kearsarge. It was a weapons-related shot, and that was the thing we did at the test site back in 1988. And the ground zero for this shot was up in Area 19 on the north end of the test site, about 50 miles north of the front gate of the test site. And after you heard Paul Robinson's comments, you know more about what was about to happen than I did at that point in time, because we had started preparing ground zero and all the things you have to do for a shot back in February, and then about the 1st of April, I got a message that there was a group of people from the Soviet Union were going to come in and set up their own experiment with their own equipment right there in my ground zero. Well, as far as working with the Soviets, I was probably in a much better position to understand those kind of things, because just coincidentally, in 1987, 1 year before all this, my son went to the Soviet Institute of Physics and spent 3 months there living night and day with Soviet scientists and technicians, and he had working on a joint U.S.-Soviet thermonuclear experiment. And he came back and he told me all of his experience he'd had in the Soviet Union, both in working with the scientists and knowing the people, and that it had been a good experience for him, surprisingly, for all of us. So I had more information about what it would be like working with Soviets. So a few days later, 7 men from the Soviet Union showed up and came prepared to start installing their experiment. Now, as you just heard, there were 2 parts to this, and I was in the part where the United States was the host and they were the visitors, and Guy was on the opposite end where the Soviet Union was the host and he was the visitor. And then Nick was responsible for all of this with both ways. It turned out that where I was fortunate, and when the visitors were here, they were here to do a job, and the job was one they were very familiar with. And in fact, the methods that they were going to use were well known by both us and the Soviets. Both of us had used these methods many times before to measure the yield of our own events. All I had to do was tell them the rules of operating in GZ and make sure they complied with them, find out what they needed, and help them out, because I figured that I wanted to give them the best opportunity to succeed as well as they could. But it was up to them to succeed, but up to me to give them the support they needed at ground zero. And I was responsible for the safety of what they were doing, safety to themselves and safety for ourselves. And the good part about this is that was kind of the only time I had to relate to the Soviets, where, on the other hand, there's many, many other things that the visitors, well, both sides are concerned about. You know, feeding, housing, inspection of equipment, storage of equipment, communications with your embassy, and even escort service. They had to be provided with escort service. And I'm not talking about the Las Vegas type. So that made it easy for me. But and so the first 7 showed up, and they were here for about 6 weeks, and then a much, much larger group came, and and everything worked out successfully on that test. But I want to point out that the Kearsarge nuclear test was not the joint verification experiment. It was what the Soviets, what the visitors were doing in both places, setting up their own equipment in the other country. That was the joint verification experiment, not the nuclear tests themselves, because my primary job was to make sure that this nuclear test would detonated on time, safely, and successfully.
In a few minutes after we finish some of the discussions, I want to talk about some of the things that I call the logistics of the JVE. Guy and Joe talk more specifically about the event and the things Joe just started now. But to answer Jordan's first question of how did I feel, I was kind of like Guy. I was one of those guys that felt this was the Cold War people, and I had no interest in being friends with them. And so in late January of 1988, I got a call from my good friend Troy Wade. Troy's sitting right here. And Troy said to me, he said, "Nick, the Soviets are coming." Well, I've known Troy for 25 years at that time. I now know him for almost 60 years. In fact, I was his deputy manager when both he and I were up at the Idaho National Engineering Laboratory in Idaho Falls, Idaho. And Troy had a way of jesting. He liked to tell jokes to me. And I assumed he was telling me a joke. The Soviets were coming to the Nevada test site. But it turned out he wasn't jesting. And he told me, he said, "Nick, as a matter of fact, in the next week, we will be taking a familiarization group of people out to the site to start the process." Some things happened immediately after that. And after Guy and Joe finish, I'll ramble a little and tell you about some of the stories, the kind of challenges we had from a logistics point of view, not from an event point of view, because those are the things that Joe and Guy could talk about. And to kind of introduce some of the things that Guy may want to talk about, one of the logistics that we had was to send 5 C-5s to the Soviet Union. Now remember, we're in the midst of a Cold War. And we have some young men from the Air Force come into our office, and we tell them, you have an assignment. You're going to fly out of Creech, which was then called the Indian Springs Air Force Base. You're going to fly C-5s into Kazakhstan. I remember that young officer just looking at me, thinking maybe I was telling him a joke. But in fact, we sent 5 C-5s from Creech, Indian Springs, over to Semipalatinsk. And Guy will chat a little bit about that.
When the C-5 arrived, the first one arrived out at the Semipalatinsk airport. There was a lot of room on a C-5. It's a huge airplane. One of the things that we did to bring over there to the test site was a drill rig that we needed to use to drill the satellite hole in which we would make the hydrodynamic yield measurement. Since there was so much room on the aircraft, the Soviets were trying to teach us, or treat us very well, I'm sure. They were feeding us as well as they could, which for our purposes left a little bit to be desired. And so I asked that they put fruits and vegetables on this airplane and send them over, and we would use those, give them to the cooks at the hotel, Gostanitsa, that we were staying in, and they could use those as a part of preparing the meals for us. And so shortly after this airplane had arrived, the drill rig was there. At lunch one day, we were fed a lot of different things, which I was not used to but here was on my plate was some green slimy stuff, and so I ate it, and I said, "This tastes like lettuce." And I discovered that they had cooked the lettuce that got sent over in this vegetables and fruits. And so I said, maybe we better let them know what we do with lettuce. And so I had my senior scientific advisor, Roger Ide. He was a good cook, and one of my interpreters go back and show the cooks what you do with lettuce and tomatoes, and showed them how to make a tossed salad, and we would use vinegar and oil as the dressing for it. And so, hey, this sounds like a good deal to me. Well, the next morning we went to breakfast, and there was a tossed salad. And so this was part of the experience that we had of developing relationships with each other. One of the things that I had to become acquainted with was that all of my office and the room where we held our meetings and my room where I slept was all bugged, so that we were being listened to for all of our conversations, and that was, I don't know, if it happened here in the U.S., I was not aware of it, so it didn't bother me, but over there, we became aware of that, and there were several instances. I don't think in the interest of time that I will go into the specifics of that, but it was just a different way for us to deal and operate with the idea that all of our conversations were being monitored, and so whenever we met, we knew that they had known whatever plans we had, they were aware of them. I have one other area that I wanted to talk about as far as food is concerned. One of the days that we were there, we had to leave the test site for some reason. They never told us, only that we needed to go off site, and so they offered us the opportunity to either go into Kurchatov City and watch films or take a tour around the test site of little villages that were located off the site. We opted to take the tour rather than spend the day being indoctrinated with Soviet films. So we went, the first place we went for lunch, we were in a yurt, which I'm presuming all of you are aware what a yurt is, a round tent made out of sheep's wool. We're sitting at the table, a little low table, and we were being served kumis, which is fermented mare's milk. I looked at that. It's yellow and it's thick, and it was not particularly appealing to me. But as the team leader, I'm the first one that gets served. So everybody is looking to see, what is he going to do? Well, I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is Mormon. And so we have a word of wisdom that says you don't drink alcoholic beverages. And so I said, well, it's fermented, so it's got alcohol in it, so I can pass on that, but I appreciate the offer. My translator sitting next to me said, I wish I had that reason. But so anyway, that was...
May I add a couple things to what you just said? Guys being very nice. When we were over at their test site, we got beer and wine. Every day, they would put up 90 bottles of beer. We had 45 people there at any given time, and they would give us 2 bottles of a very good Czech beer, and it was a larger bottle than what we're accustomed to. So 2 bottles was plenty, let me assure you. And then in the evening, at dinner, for each table of 4, you got 1 bottle of white wine. Not very good, but a bottle of white wine. As Guy says, he's not a drinker. So when I was there, I made sure I sat at the same table as Guy every evening. It was kind of nice to get his 2 bottles of beer and most of his white wine. So I don't know if I thanked him then, but I want to publicly thank Guy right now. Thank you, Guy. I want to go back to that phone call from Troy Wade. I hope everybody knows Troy. He's sitting right here, right? The other thing that Troy told me on that famous phone call of the Russians, the Soviets are coming, he said, we've been told they want to spend 1 night in Las Vegas. I said, that's no problem. We'll take care of that, Troy. So I sent some of our people from our visitor's office down to the Golden Nugget and told them just to make reservations for approximately 50 people. And by the way, I had authorization of $55 per room per person from Washington. So our people went down there, and an hour later they come back in. They said, Nick, we literally got thrown out of the Golden Nugget. They didn't even want to talk to us. I said, Linda Smith and I will go down and take care of this. So Linda and I went down and talked to the general manager. Steve Wynn then owned it, the general manager, and I pled to his national behavior. This is an important national thing. We got nowhere. Finally, I begged, literally begged, and he caved in and said to me, fine, but don't ever ask again. And I was a little confused by why he was taking such a long stance, a hard stance on this. And he said to me, he said, I expect to get $8,000 a night from that room. I said, $8,000 a night? He said, yes, that's what we expect from gambling, drinking, food, and the cost of the room. And you're giving me $55. I had forgotten it was Super Bowl week. Late January 1988 was Super Bowl week. And here we're pleading for an entire floor on the back facility down there at $55 a night. And he did give it to us, and we spent the 1 night, but we never asked for it again. Joe, do you have any comment?
Not on what you just said, but I did get to go to Kazakhstan. After we fired the shot here, I got to go over there mainly so I could observe the way they did their testing and compare it with what we were doing here. But some of the things that surprised me, and later I didn't know why it surprised me, but the Kazakhstan test site is almost exactly on the other side of the world from here. Oh, which reminds me of something else. I understand that when they were trying to negotiate when were we going to shoot these shots, that both sides were saying they have to be shot simultaneously because nobody else wanted to go first. And I finally pointed out to them, if you do that, somebody's going to have to shoot in the dark because they're on opposite sides of the world. But so they finally settled it a month apart. If you look at geological time, you can call it simultaneous. But the thing, when I got to that test site, and it was September, which is a nice time of year anywhere, for some reason I thought things on the other side of the world would look different. Their test site looks almost exactly like the NTS. I mean, it's flat land with hills around it, and so that was, it made me think about things like that.
I actually will follow up on something you just said, and this can go to you, Joe, or anyone who has any input on it. Did you notice any differences between the way that we conducted tests and the way that they did? I'm curious about processes, if there were differences there or anything like that. And kind of related to that, I'm presuming that there were aspects of our testing that we had to keep classified, that we weren't exposing everything to them. And I'm curious how we were able to do that while they're there. Do we have any policies or procedures in place to protect information that we couldn't share since they're standing right next to us in some cases?
Well, of course, that was a big issue, and so they weren't allowed to go any place. They were escorted all the time they were here. And Guy, were you escorted over there?
Oh, absolutely. We weren't, we didn't have that. The only way we had transportation was because they provided it to us, and we were always escorted. And to answer one of your questions about the differences in how the tests were conducted, it's important to realize that at the Nevada test site, we conducted our tests in dry holes. At the Soviet test site, their water table was only 40 meters below the surface, and so you could stand on their emplacement hole and you could see water down there. And so their testing was essentially done like the container for their nuclear device was like a submarine. It was about a 2-inch thick stainless steel container that was put down to 600 meters depth, and so it was and all of their, of course, their diagnostic equipment and all that kind of stuff had to be conducted in a waterproof condition. So that was a huge difference from the way we conducted our tests out at the test site where our holes are dry.
Let me comment on something on that. Some of you who may be familiar with how a test goes out here, we have a very strict way before the shot of letting the test controller and the test director approve going ahead with the shot. That includes, there's Chuck Costa sitting back here. Chuck was head of the Environmental Protection Agency, Public Health Service, and his people would be surrounding the test site, knowing all people who were either mining or ranching or farming. In the event of a worst-case scenario and you had to evacuate people, his people would evacuate the people. At the table would be a weatherman going over closely the weather, and if the wind conditions weren't in a certain direction, the test controller would not approve shooting the shot. He had advisors advising him on various things. So the Soviets learned what we were doing, and when Jim Magruder and I came over and met with Guy over at Semipalatinsk, it was obvious the Soviets were going to try to copy our way of doing things. And they invited Jim Magruder and I to sit in on their review. And it was obvious that they had never done it before. But they were going to convince us that it was a matter of course, that this is how they approved the execution of an event, that weather conditions were such that everything, very similar to ours. You could see they were almost imitating what we do out here at the test site. And it was obvious to Jim and I that that's exactly what it was imitating.
And one reason it was easy for them to do that was because a month earlier, they said we invited them to sit in and listen to all of that, which goes on for a long time. And apparently they noticed what we were doing.
Now that we've built the Soviets up, let me tell you the rest of the story. On this tour that we took around the test site where I talked about the kumis, or the kefir kumis, we went on around to a little community called Ka'arul, and they had another yurt set up for us and a nice program, and then they gave us dinner. And the sitting next to me was the ranking Soviet official in that part of the country. I presume he might be equivalent to a chairman of the county commission or something like that for us. But he told me in the course of doing of dinner, he said, you know, the Soviets, when they were doing atmospheric testing, purposely conducted one of their tests such that, and the wind was blowing so that all of the debris from the test floated down over our little community, and we essentially became the guinea pigs for them to determine what effects do radiation from a nuclear test have on a population. And so those people, they didn't have very kind feelings towards the test site, needless to say, but still that was another aspect of how the Soviets conducted some of their operations. Let me just finish with one other experience there at this dinner we had. I had, once again, being the team leader, they came in with a tray that had a brown sheep's head on it, and next to it were, they told me, I had to ask, what is that mess of stuff there? Well, that's the brains. And they said, you get the first opportunity to eat the sheep's head. And so here was about 50 people sitting in this yurt looking at me, wondering what the heck what's he going to do? And I had my medical advisor, doctor, was, I'm trying to remember his name, doesn't matter. He was from Eastern Europe, and he was telling me, take the eyeball, that's the delicacy. And I thought, oh man, that's beyond me. And so
Remember, this is a guy that couldn't handle their one clove of garlic in our regular meals over there. But before I forget, and time will run out, and there'll be a couple of things we'll forget. We use the term we and us quite a bit. I want to make sure you all know who we and us are, because that's important. Because the test site is truly a team of many organizations. You who live in Las Vegas a long time, you'll ask somebody, where does your family work? Where's your parents work? And at one time, everybody had a relative at the test site. In 1988, we had 11,000 people working at the site, doing a lot of things. But people would always say, oh, he works at the site. Well, you work at the site, but you work for somebody. And so there's a lot of people involved in the we and the us. Obviously, the national laboratories, Los Alamos, Livermore, and Sandia National Laboratory. And the Department of Defense, the Defense Nuclear Agency, known as that then. I know they changed their name now. There was also the many contractors we had at the site. The principal ones at the time were Reynolds Electric and Engineering Company, RICO. And we have with us today Dale Fraser, who was the general manager of RICO at the time. EG&G, we have Pete Zavatero here, who was the general manager of EG&G at the time. Holmes and Narver was our architect engineering firm at the site then. Wackenhut Services were our security contractor. So you had all these people. And then you had other federal agencies. You had, I mentioned Chuck Costas here. Chuck was head of the Public Health Service people at the site. He had some 65 to 70 people working for him. The USGS, the United States Geological Survey, you know, we're the most well-diagnosed piece of land in the world, I think. If you ever go out to the site, there's warehouses full of core samples, for example. I'm sure I'm missing somebody else. Oh, of course, the National Weather Service was out there. And many, many other people. Now, during this particular experiment, we also had the State Department, because they were involved with, of course, with Dr. Robinson. We had the Arms Control Organization, and we had the On-Site Inspection Agency, which is a branch of the Department of Defense. Is that right, Joe? No? Oh, they were not? They were an independent?
Well, they were part of ACTO, which was under the State Department.
Okay, under the State Department. But anyway, when we say we and us, I wanted to make sure you know who we and us. And of course, then there was DOE.
Okay, you got
Guy and I.
You got to us.
And I didn't introduce myself earlier when Jordan said we shouldn't. My Nick Aquilina, but I was the manager of the Department of Energy's site here, office here. I had come back down from Idaho when Troy and I were, he was the manager of Idaho and I was his deputy. But prior to that, I started at the Nevada Test Site in 1962. So I was there for a long time before we went to Idaho. Anyway, I wanted to make that point. You know, I want to remind everybody, we were hosting for the better part of a year the senior nuclear people from a country that we were in the midst of a Cold War. And we've been in that Cold War essentially since 1945. Many of them never were out of the state, out of their country, until they came here. Many of them couldn't speak a word of English. Some did, but some couldn't speak a word of English. And we had to do the same over there. You know, we sent people over there. First time we ever were was in Russia, and et cetera. So there were a lot of what I call logistical challenges because one of the protocols that Paul mentioned in the briefing there was that they established a limit of personnel, and that limit was 45. So at any given time, we could only have 45 people in Semipalatinsk, and they could only have 45 people at the test site here. You really had to do a lot of coordination with people to make sure you had the right people at the right time doing the right thing. For example, when we had to send the drillers over, that was mentioned, other people had to leave. So you had to move people in and out. At times we needed EG&G people there. At other times you needed Los Alamos and Livermore people there. So it was an interesting game to make sure you were within that 45 people. That's all that were allowed. And of course the same for the Soviets coming here. They were only allowed 45, so they had to be careful about that. So there were a lot of logistical things about that. And if we have some time, I'll mention a few other things.
I'd like to make one comment about language. My experience with the Soviets that I met here, that very fortunately, most of them spoke English, because in other parts of these, like in Mercury and where other negotiations were going about feeding and housing and all that kind of stuff, I think they had interpreters, but up at Ground Zero, we didn't have any interpreters. But fortunately, the Russians could speak enough English that they could let me know what they needed. And also, physicists and engineers, if you got diagrams, a schematic or something, the symbols look the same in all different languages, and sometimes we could do that. But I asked why it was that so many of them were able to speak English, and they told me it was a requirement in the Soviet Union that when you're in school, you have to learn Russian and English.
I have two more questions I'm going to ask you, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. The first is that, Guy, you told some amazing stories about sort of the culture shock of the cuisine over there, and I'm wondering if you have any stories you can share about Soviet culture shock here. And there's particularly a grocery store story that I want somebody to tell because it's a good one. The second question, you guys work your way through to it, is we started off by talking about there was some hesitation about this because the Soviets were our enemies through all of this. And I'm wondering, by the end of it, did you trust them more? Did you build any lasting friendships or relationships? Or did you kind of always stay very professional and there was no like real bonding that happened that maybe lasted beyond this?
Yeah, let me comment about the food. Is that on? Yeah. You know, all of a sudden we had 45 Soviets at the test site who we had to feed 3 times a day at least. Now, a lot of you who know the steakhouse in Mercury know what a wonderful steakhouse that was as far as the quality of the food and the quantity of the food. And Dale's people were just fantastic. But all of a sudden we had these Soviets and we weren't sure what they liked, but we were sure they were going to drink a lot of vodka. Well, it turned out that was not their choice. Brandy was their choice. And for a while, I don't think we were prepared in the inventory at the site to have enough brandy, but we sure had a lot of vodka they didn't drink. I just found that interesting at the time. The second thing is, you know, when you have those people, you don't work every day, and there's off time. So we had to make sure they were taken care of in their off time. And people like Ernie Williams, who's sitting back here, and a lady named Frances Gwynn, who unfortunately is ill at this time, they became the people that would take them to Mount Charleston for a picnic. They would take them down to Target to shop. They would take them to stores to buy stuff for their spouses back home, and they didn't understand our sizing. So they would look around the store for a woman or a man who was the size of their, and go over and kind of hug them and say, this size, so they could buy something. They did request, and it was a little more of a challenge, to go to Disney World, Disneyland. And we actually, Francis escorted them to Disneyland, which they loved, but surprised us because they wanted to see the Pacific Ocean. I'm never sure why. But so here were a bunch of Russians on the shores of California in suits with their pants rolled up and their shoes off, walking in the water for some strange reason. But a few of them had a bottle of beer and the cops came. And our people who were with them needed to quickly tell the cops, hey, these are Soviets and they don't understand our rules and they are in suits and ties, but etc. So it was those kind of things. We played baseball, softball a lot at the test site, and Chuck Costa, famous tennis player, would play tennis with them. It was interesting to watch them play baseball, softball, which they didn't understand, but they would hit the ball and run to third instead of running to first. But it was fun anyway. And so with people like Ernie Williams and Frances Gwynn, took them on the off hours to these things.
I think there's one other aspect of of food here in Las Vegas. The Soviets were taken to a local grocery store to buy toothpaste and sundry things that they needed to support themselves out here. They could not believe the variety of items that were available to be bought, and it, you know, they were asking, what kind of toothpaste should I buy? I mean, that was my experience, was going past a grocery store on Red Square and looking in the window, and literally there were like a few cans of canned peas on the shelf and some wilted carrots. That was it in that grocery store. So they felt like this was a Potemkin village for our grocery store, that this was not really the way we lived. We were just trying to impress them. And so Chuck McWilliam was escorting them, said, okay, here's a telephone directory, you choose a store and we'll go there. So that was part of what they had to learn, was that there is a large choice of things that compared to what they were used to in their country.
I don't mean to be hogging the stories, but there's so many interesting night stories. We took them to see Siegfried and Roy at the Old Frontier, when the Old Frontier was here. And we had dinner in the steakhouse, and then we went to see Siegfried and Roy. And Siegfried and Roy couldn't have been nicer. They allowed us to all go up on stage. There's pictures, many pictures of us up on stage after the show I'm talking about. And they took out their baby tigers, or whatever you would call them, the white tigers. And the Soviets loved those kind of animals. And on the way back to the site that night, Ernie Williams' son worked out at Smith's over at off Jones in 95, and we stopped there, and as Guy said, A, they thought it was a setup, that we had set that store up because they couldn't believe it, and two, they just loved just walking around looking at those things. I know we're running out of time, so let me finish with a last story. Their team leader was a guy named Viktor Mikhailov. Brilliant, brilliant guy and a tough guy. Joe and I could confirm his toughness. But he was a brilliant guy, and in some ways he was a humorous guy. And he later became, by the way, the Minister of Atomic Energy, Ministry of Atomic Energy for the Soviet Union, which essentially was a cabinet position. So he really rose up in the ranks. But we had some social activities at my house, and he got a kick out of my wife because my wife would kid him about his smoking habits and wouldn't let him smoke in the house. And I used to say, honey, let him smoke. But he would go outside and smoke, and he would kid around with Frida. A few months later, I'm over in Geneva with Paul Robinson at a meeting, and Paul says, we're going to lunch at the at the Russian embassy, the Soviet embassy. So I'm invited to go. I'm the low man on the totem pole. We got ambassadors and these kind of people, and I'm just being very quiet at the end of the line where they introduce everybody. And everybody's being introduced. Well, they come to Viktor Mikhailov. And Viktor stops, and he walks over to me. Here I'm at the end of the line, and he hands me a gift. And he said, this is for Frida. I'm sure the other people in line thought, who the hell is Frida? It was the only gift that was traded. And it was a pair of bedroom slippers from an animal skin that she wore for the next 10 years, I swear. So, but that's the kind of guy Viktor was. And to answer that question of did we develop some trust, and yes. And when you're ready to close, I want to read 2 sentences that Viktor wrote. Maybe we could read them now.
Sure.
Victor wrote many books, by the way, and he gave us a number of his books, one of them called I Am a Hawk. And I noticed on Amazon last night, it's now selling on Amazon for $104. But and mine's autographed, so it's probably worth more than $104. But Victor made these two statements in writing. He said, I am certain that the main result of the JVE was not the development of procedures and the extent of nuclear test monitoring of the joint development of technical verification means, but the chance for interpersonal communications with the American nuclear physicists. So he's written that. His second one was, I have always dreamed of seeing how U.S. experts at the Nevada test site, and I can tell you, they are excellent experts, very friendly, very warm people. We have cut a window into their heart as well. Victor, a good writer. But that were two statements that he made in writing. And of course, when he referred to excellent experts, very friendly and very warm, he's referring to people like these two.
Okay, does anyone in the audience have any questions? Yes. It got a little bit of use.
Just to finish the story of the alcohol, normally the test site out at the Soviet test site in Kazakhstan was dry. So the fact that the fact that there was beer there and alcohol, that was in deference to us, not because of that's normal operating procedure.
You mean I can buy all this meat? I said, yes, you can, through the interpreter. And so my question was, how much are you allowed to buy meat for your family during the week? I was shocked. They got 8 ounces of meat a week. And they were looking at the meat counter and said, I can buy any of that? I said, yes, you can. That was a great experience for me. And I just wanted to share that with you. Thanks.
Any other questions?
A quick story. Troy Wade and Joe Salgado came to Semipalatinsk on prior to the shot day to stay for the shot. Joe Salgado had just been appointed as the Deputy Secretary of Energy, and he was also appointed as the United States representative to Vienna, to the commission there. In the day room of our barracks at the test site in the Soviet Union, Troy Wade had a Bible, probably the first Bible ever in that facility. But he actually swore Joe Salgado in with a bunch of generals from the Soviet Army with medals up and down, standing there. And we have some great pictures of that scene. But here's Troy doing the swearing in of a guy who says, I swear to defend my nation against all enemies. And here we are standing in the middle of a bunch of Soviet generals, and they all clapped. It was very interesting. And it was interesting because Joe Salgado is half Russian, and Joe then gave an interesting speech about being half Russian and being now in the Soviet Union and being sworn in as the Deputy Secretary of Energy.
Other questions? Yes.
I know that people did keep in touch with quite a few of them, but let me remind you that most of the people that were involved in this were 50 or 60 years old 30 years ago. So most of them are gone now.
And I think, just to answer your question, for me personally, my answer to you is no, because I did not develop that really close relationship. But I know that there were scientific people from the labs, Los Alamos and Livermore and Sandia, that did develop close relationships, and they kept in close contact. And in fact, after the JVE, there were a number of relationships or a number of activities that were engaged in between us and the Soviets or the Russians. By 1991, Soviet Union was gone. So I know that there was that kind of relationship that got developed.
To further answer your question, 5 years ago, we had a very major celebration of the 25th anniversary. This is the 30th. It was sponsored by our headquarters, Department of Energy. We had 5 lab directors there, but we had significant representatives from the Soviet Union that were part of the thing. They all came over here. Over on in North Las Vegas, we had a very major celebration between the two, and there was a lot of friendliness in that room that day that I saw.
I can add one personal bit of information to this. I told you my son went over there 31 years ago to work with Soviet physicists, and the Soviet physicist that was in charge of that operation then is now an employee of the Lawrence Livermore Lab with a Q clearance.
I hate to keep talking, but for you who come to a lot of our talks here, I hope all you do come back for future ones. We've had Khrushchev's son here as one of our speakers twice, as a matter of fact. From Brown, he was at Brown University and now retired, I guess. But we've had him here twice, and it was interesting having these kind of discussions with him and his feelings toward us. And there was another thought I had, but it slipped my mind now.
One last thing I need to say, just when the test was conducted, the test was called Shagan. Normally the Soviets numbered their test, but for us they named it. I stood 4 kilometers, just 2.5 miles from ground zero at the head of their cable run from the ground zero. That's the closest I had ever been to a nuclear test. It was exciting. That ground wave was 10 or 12 feet high. It flipped me in the air, and that's one of the memories I have of nuclear weapons testing that I carry with me. That was excitement of the highest order.
What I was saying was that both sides agreed that neither side violated the 150 kiloton limit. But these measurements are not that precise, because there are variations in the geology there. But both sides agreed that, and they compared data with each other, and because both the U.S. and the Soviets had those measurements on both of those tests, so they both had information on each of the 2 tests, and even though they weren't exactly the same, they agreed that they were close enough that nobody had violated the 150.
Okay, I'm gonna wrap it up. I want to thank all of you for coming. And just a quick note, if you didn't get a chance to look beforehand, we have some artifacts over here, and Guy brought some over there from the JVE, so take a look at those because there's some pretty cool stuff. Thank you all so much for coming. And thank you to our panelists.